Welcome to The Faithful Steward. This is a podcast all about sharing biblical wisdom and practical insights in order to help church leaders pursue and teach financial freedom as part of Christian discipleship. We believe this is a spiritual conversation, and this is a place where the church needs to lead the way in order to move our communities forward in how we steward God's resources. I'm your host, James Lenhoff, and I am so passionate about this conversation and helping leaders have the confidence to step into it. We believe that if we help people thrive financially and grow spiritually, it changes everything. And I am so excited to join you on this journey. This podcast is brought to you by Good Sense. If you'd like more information about what we're up to, you can go to our website at goodsensemovement.org. All right, let's get started with today's conversation. Well, as I mentioned last week in our podcast, we're going to talk about college today. We talked a little bit about preparing kids as they enter college, making sure they understand what they're taking on and what this whole thing involves. But today I want to talk about parents and how we prepare for college ourselves. How do we save for it? How do we talk about it with our kids? How do we enter into that season? As this podcast is coming out, we are entering into the summer, and we are about to start the school year in just a month or two. And many of you are going to be sending your kids to college. And so I thought now is a great time to just dive into this whole topic of college. I think we've now built into our culture, for a lot of us, that college is an expectation. It's kind of the bare minimum. It's just what we do. We've also told ourselves for now generations that, people who go to college make more money, and so it's the path you have to go down in order for you to be successful. And that's not true. I mean, statistically speaking, yes, people who finish college, who graduate with a degree, do end up having an opportunity to make more money. Statistically speaking, that is an option. That is correct. However, people who don't finish college, people who finance a bunch of school but don't actually get a degree, most often end up making similar incomes to those who never went, but now they're just dragging student loans around with them for the rest of their lives. And so this is a really big undertaking. This is something we need to think seriously about, talk thoroughly through with our kids. We need to make sure as a couple we're not taking on more than we can afford. As we talk to our kids about college, we want to make sure we're setting clear expectations of what we are going to be able to do as a family to help them in that process. There's a lot of unspoken assumption that happens in this topic around college. We need to stop leaving it unspoken and start diving into some of those harder conversations. So let's start with just the mistakes that I see people make often. One really big mistake right out of the gate is that people tend to assume that our kids have to follow the same path that we went down. So if we went to college, our kids have to go to college. It's just the deal. That's not necessarily true. We need to challenge that assumption and ask the question, is this the right path for this child? Many times I see families pushing kids into college simply because it's what mom and dad did, but the kid would be better served in so many different ways, maybe an apprenticeship in a skilled trade, maybe a technical school, maybe some other avenue that leads to a very thriving career, but instead we assume the only path they can take is the path we walk down. Scripture tells us very clearly that we are to raise our children up in the way that they should go. It doesn't tell us to raise them up in the way that we went. It tells us to be attentive, to be aware of the path that they should walk down for themselves, the skills that they have, the talents, the level of aptitude, the interests and passions that they have. Those all need to be considered. And a lot of times we don't consider any of that stuff. We just assume the path they walk is the path we walked. And that is something we need to challenge before we start walking down a path that actually serves to be a detriment, a disadvantage to our kids, rather than the advantage that we think it's going to give them. Let me real quick talk about this idea of it being a disadvantage. A lot of times it's hard for people to think that college would be a disadvantage. For many kids that get into school, first of all, getting to that place of being in a certain school, we've idolized and put on pedestals some of these institutions. And so you have to get into thus and such school. You have to get into Penn because we went to Penn. You have to get into Ivy League. You have to get into, a Big Ten school. Whatever our history is, we put that weight on our kids and say, you need to get to here. And so they already feel this sense of oppressive expectation. And many times we're setting them up for failure. We're putting them into a pressure cooker that they're not designed to endure. They're not ready. They're not built for it. And we say, it doesn't matter. You have to do it. And so we actually put them at disadvantage because now they start to feel like a failure. They start to tell themselves that they're not good enough. They're not as good as mom and dad were. They're not as capable, not as talented. And none of those things are true, but they have lots of evidence to believe that they're true because we've set all these expectations up for them. And so one of the thoughts I have around this stuff is just clear the slate. Seek the Lord's guidance in what he would have your child pursue instead of what you would have them pursue. Ask the question. Be more open to it. I've told my kids, there is no expectation from me that you have to go to college, that you will go to college. None of that is in place. There is no bare minimum expectation that I have on you. What I expect of you is that you will honor the Lord with the work of your hands. End of sentence. That's it. And whatever they want to pursue, I just want them to honor God with that pursuit. That's really the highest calling, the way that they should go. That's what I think that ultimately looks like, in my opinion. I know a lot of you are probably challenged by that and saying, no, college is a must. Just question that. One of the other mistakes that I see is that we take our kids on all these different college tours and they fall in love with a certain campus, a certain location, a certain school that is in a certain sports conference. They fall in love with this place because we take them to several different beautiful places. And all of these campuses are designed to be gorgeous. They're incredibly impressive. And so the kid falls in love with a location, and that is what makes the decision. The decision to go to a certain school needs to be much more multifaceted than just we went on a college tour and we loved the place. We don't want to leave this decision entirely up to the emotion that our child felt when they were on that campus. Because now we're walking down a path, we're hanging the curtains, we're starting to talk about, I'm going to go to this school, it's going to be great. And they start to identify themselves as a student at that school. But we haven't stopped to ask the question, can we afford that school? Is this actually going to work? Can we get the degree that aligns with your passions that actually sets you up for success for a career where you're thriving at that school? Is it the most efficient, most effective way for us to get to that finish line that actually, by the way, is the starting line for the rest of their life? Is this the most efficient way for us to get to that starting line if we're only asking which school did you like the best? We are missing so many more variables that we need to consider. And so we don't want to leave this decision up to just whichever one felt the most exciting, felt the most beautiful, or is connected to something they're really excited about. That isn't enough. We need to do the deep dive work to decide together as a family which of these are actually viable options before we even start going on a bunch of tours. It's kind of like when people are shopping for a house. When you go to the bank and you ask them, how much money can I borrow? How much house can I afford? You're asking the wrong question. You're asking the lender, how much can I borrow? And they'll let you borrow way more than you can actually really afford comfortably. But then you start shopping for a house that you can't afford. And the truth is, those most expensive houses, they're really pretty. They're really nice. And you start to fall in love with that level of house, but it is not the level of house you actually can comfortably afford. The same is true when it comes to colleges. Don't start taking tours of places that you cannot actually go. because you will then start to force yourselves as a family to make that happen. And it can destroy your financial future. So the most important piece of how to solve some of these problems where we're kind of allowing emotion to drive, we're making assumptions that college has to be part of the equation. One of the most important pieces to fix that is to have conversations, to start talking to your kids about this stuff really early. In my opinion, that needs to start well before high school. And that's not a conversation where when they're in junior high, you're saying, hey, how are you going to get into Yale, right? We don't want to start putting this pressure on them early, but we do want to start opening the dialogue of, hey, what does it look like? What are you thinking? What are you excited about? What types of careers are interesting to you? We need to actually get to a place where they're at an age where some of those thoughts can start to form, and it needs to be an open, ongoing conversation. Notice in them what they have really obvious curiosity and interest in, and start talking about what are the things that people do that would be harnessing that curiosity and that passion. And then what degrees do those people need? What education would it take in order to step into those kinds of careers? Those are really fun and exciting conversations that aren't oppressive. There's no, you have to get here, you have to do these things so that this can happen. It's more of a wandering together, a discovery of what this kid is wired for and what God has designed them to pursue. And as those things start to unfold, then as you decide, hey, that's going to take this kind of degree, it's going to take an associate's degree, or it's going to take a bachelor's, or maybe even a master's. Early on in the conversation, we want to be talking about what is a healthy way for us to get there. What can we afford? What are mom and dad actually able to help with? What are the different paths we can go down, and how much do they cost? Those are important things for kids to be aware of. We need them to know that there are limitations that we are under. That is healthy and reasonable for them to navigate those limitations, understand that the world is not open to them entirely. There are, by definition, levels that we can do. And as a family, we can afford this type of school, that type of school, this type of degree. But beyond that, we're financing it. And we need to understand, what does that mean? How do we actually build this thing out? And so as they're in high school and they're starting to get closer to that being a reality, they've already got some of those understandings in their head. They've already gotten familiar with some of the costs, some of the options. Maybe as they're in high school, they're intentional about taking some of these college credit courses so they can start to reduce the cost of some of those courses they're going to have to take in school. Those are the kinds of decisions that we can open them up to as they step into that high school stage, so that they're already seeing the value of some of those decisions and how they impact the costs of the next level of schooling, if that's something they've decided they're going to pursue. Those are the ways we want to open some of those things up so that they're fully aware. And then when they step into that next level of going to college, they know the numbers. We don't want to hide it from them, even if we're paying for it. We don't want to hide it from them. We don't want this to be an unknown thing. They need to recognize the investment that college actually is and take it seriously. This is part of why I think opening the conversation around money with your kids early and often is so critical, because I don't think kids will naturally want to engage in the conversation about how much college costs. It's an overwhelming thought. It's really complicated. It's super confusing. And we don't want them to shy away from this. We want them to engage in this very comfortably. We want this to be a normal conversation that feels really familiar, that they're not intimidated by, they're not afraid of, and they're not overwhelmed by the thought of college costs. Speaking of those costs, what is the responsibility of mom and dad? How do we want to be thinking about this? I see so often families that have over-prioritized paying for college to the degree that they have ignored all the other financial responsibilities that they have. So they are undersaved for retirement. They're carrying a much heavier debt burden than they really should be at the stage of life that they're in, but they've saved a ton of money for their kids to go to college. And the problem with that approach is we are setting up a future where those kids have to support us because we are not okay. We have not put ourselves in a position where we are firmly established, where retirement is confident and steady, where we know that we are prepared for our own future because we've been so focused on buying our kids' future for them. We need to get that the other way around. We have to be okay. We need to prioritize our financial responsibilities above anything else. And if those needs are being met, if we are saving adequately, we're giving adequately, we're doing the work of a faithful steward, and there are resources that can be applied to the cost of college, go for it. It's a wonderful gift to give your kids. It is not a requirement. We have convinced ourselves, we've put this burden on ourselves as parents that we have to pay for our kids' college. That is not true. You do not have to do that. You do not have responsibility for that cost. As much as we want to give our kids everything and we want them to have every opportunity and every advantage, and I understand that, but there is not a biblical responsibility for you to take that on. And if you are taking that on to the detriment of your own security and safety and stability to the point where you are no longer able to be obedient to the owner of these resources because you're scrambling and you're scrapping and you're in trouble and you're scared, you are setting yourselves up for a future that is not looking a lot like faithful stewardship. It's looking a whole lot more like a scarcity ownership mindset where we're overly focused on getting ourselves back to a place of security because we spent so much money on our kids' college. We become dependent on them in the future rather than recognizing our role, our responsibility of taking care of ourselves. And so do not get that backwards. And as you're leading communities, as you're talking to families that are asking this question, if they're talking about college from a very young age, they're talking about their toddler and they're saving already for them to go to Harvard, check that with them, challenge them on it. We need to step into that conversation and ask the question, are you prioritizing these things in the right order? Because if we put college costs before anything else, we will miss everything else and leave ourselves in a really, really bad situation. Once you have nailed down as a couple what you want to be responsible for your kids' college, then those things need to be communicated to your kids early and often, particularly as they're getting closer to stepping into college. We want to make sure that those conversations are happening where it's, hey, looks like mom and dad can cover about 50% of the cost of this thing if that's the school you want to go to. We also could cover 100% if you go to this school. So if you're going to get an associate's degree, you're going to go to community college, you're going to do an apprenticeship program, those things we can cover 100%. And if you're going to go to this thing, it looks like we're at about 50, 60%. So what do you think makes the most sense for you? Right? Those are conversations that we need to be talking about because we've decided ahead of time, this is what we can do. We don't want to be sucked into this momentum of they're going to go to this amazing school and we'll figure it out. We'll just make it happen somehow. Those kinds of wishful thinking, kind of emotionally charged things can put us in a situation where we will make really irrational financial decisions in order to make something happen because we're caught up in the moment and we're making the decision then. We want to be making these decisions way ahead of time, drawing those lines, deciding this far, no further. This is what we can do, and making sure our children then are making decisions on the path that they're going to choose based on those realistic expectations and commitments. Then when they're given the menu of options of what path they can choose, the one that is the most effective and efficient and gets them to a place where they can thrive will become really, really obvious. Knowing that is what protects them from choosing the wrong path and getting wound up in a whole lot of debt that doesn't actually lead to substantially more income. Those are the kinds of mistakes we got to protect them from, and that takes conversations and drawing those lines and those boundaries way in advance. Another thing to consider is a gap year. And I know a lot of times we've put on our kids that if they don't go straight from graduating high school into college, that somehow means they're failing. I've actually seen that lead to so much beauty, because that year or two where they're able to get some space from school gives them an opportunity to understand work ethic, to grow in their abilities to test different things that they might be interested in at a low entry level, just to understand what those actually look like, what careers really take in the area that they might have some interest in. Then they can start to aim themselves when they go to college a year or two later. It is a beautiful thing. I actually have a couple of friends that are college professors, and they highly recommend gap years. They are big, big fans of this idea because they've seen these kids that come in that really do need some maturing. They really do need to grow a little bit in their self-confidence, in their work ethic, and the ability for them to know themselves. And they can't do that as effectively as college students as they would if they were actually out in the real world experiencing some of these things firsthand. And so don't just completely negate that as an option. There might be some beautiful growth that's available to your kid in those gap years that actually prepares them for more success and more thriving when they do step into college. Look, I know college is such a hot topic, such a difficult thing to navigate, but I think we want this to be a thoughtful, logical, rational process for our entire family. We want mom and dad to feel confident that what we've committed to is not going to destroy us. We want our kid to feel confident that what they're stepping into is something that will lead to a future they're excited about. And those don't happen accidentally and automatically. They take a lot of intentional conversation. They take a lot of prayer and seeking the Holy Spirit's guidance to know what direction we should choose, what is the right path. Those are things we don't tend to trip into. Don't just assume that these are all easy, obvious next steps. Start to do the work in order to be ready to honor God with the resources that you have been given to manage by investing those resources into the way that your child should go, in a way that sets them up for thriving and for their own experience of faithful stewardship as their family gets started. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Faithful Steward podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and other information that we mentioned in today's episode. Also, be sure to check out our website at goodsensemovement.org to get all the resources we offer churches to help equip them in teaching financial stewardship to their community. If you have any questions or any topics you want to make sure we cover on our show, you can email me at jameslenhoff@goodsensemovement.org. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you all have a great week. We'll talk to you next week.